Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Yes. All right. Great. Well, my name is Patrick Spiro. I'm the executive officer here at the American Philosophical Society. And as you probably see, we have some cameras with us tonight. So I just want to let everybody know my introduction is going to be, it may appear a little awkward to you, but I'm told that's the way to do it for C-SPAN. And C-SPAN, I should note, only comes out to books that are really great books. And this is going to be available for sale afterwards, and these are all things I have to tell you now, not beforehand. So what they like for their videos is for me to do all the housekeeping up front. I then pause. We all pretend you didn't hear anything, and I welcome you again to the American Philosophical Society. Okay, so it's going to be, just so you know what's going on, it's not that what's wrong with that guy up there if we just heard all this. So a few housekeeping things. First off, our next public lecture is July the 1st. This is also a special lecture, a special event for a couple of reasons. First off, it's the last one of our spring semester. We won't be having meetings again until September for our public lectures. We're also going to be announcing the public launch of a project you probably have heard us talk about. It's called The Revolutionary City, which is a remarkable collaborative project between a number of Philadelphia institutions that have been spending the last several years digitizing a massive amount of materials that relate to the American Revolution here in Philadelphia. And on July the 1st, 2025, we're going to be publicly launching this incredible online archive that has broken down the walls, which are oftentimes barriers to access between these institutions, to create a one-stop shop online archive with over 40,000 pages of manuscripts. 50,000 pages of manuscripts. I'm always accused of inflating, and now it's deflating. But that will be followed by a public lecture by a distinguished curator, John Bidwell, who has spent years himself studying the Declaration of Independence and studying the history of the Declaration and its various printings as well. And so he's going to be talking about his new book, The History of the Declaration of Independence. So that's on July the 1st, and we have a great lineup for the fall. We will have all the information on the fall lectures then, but just to tease a few things, we have a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian coming in October. She just won a Pulitzer for a book on Native American history. We have a special performance that the CEO of the Constitution Center is putting together in September, a musical performance on September the 8th. And we also are going to be celebrating one of our books that we published here. It's a study of Benjamin Franklin and his diplomacy during the American Revolution. So check out online. These will be posted soon online, and definitely come July the 1st, where we'll also have a handout for our fall lineup. But we're here tonight to hear about Michelle McDonald and her book, so we're going to go through that process. You all just didn't hear me. Well, welcome, everybody, to the American Philosophical Society. My name is Patrick Spiro, and I'm the executive officer of the American Philosophical Society here tonight. And we are in for a very special treat tonight. And it's a very special event for the Philosophical Society, because people often ask me, well, what does the Philosophical Society do? Do you do philosophy? And I often have to explain what the APS does and what we stand for. And when you think about it, what the APS comes down to is one word. It's scholarship. Everything we do aims to reflect the best scholarship. We reflect excellence in scholarship. And when you look at all the various programs that we support, that's what we aim to support and also what we aim to represent. Whether it's electing members, we have over 850 elected members. Over 100 Nobel laureates are members of the American Philosophical Society. Whether it's through our books and publications, we have the longest continuously operating scholarly press in North America, or whether it's through all the research and grants that we provide, over 300 research grants every year to support early career scholars in all different fields. We aim to support and reflect excellence in scholarship. And what makes tonight so special is that we get to celebrate excellence in scholarship produced by one of our own, Michelle McDonald. Now, I know Michelle may be familiar to many of you, but to those that aren't, she's been a longtime friend of mine. Let me tell you a little bit about Michelle's background before we get to her book, the book itself. So Michelle is the librarian and director of the American Philosophical Society, a position that goes all the way back to 18th century, when I believe the first holder of the position was David Rittenhouse himself. She joined the society in 2024, where she had a real big mess to clean up. No one's laughing. I was the librarian before her. And she comes with great skills to clean up that mess. She has over 3 decades of experience, both as a scholar, as an administrator, and as a teacher. She joined us from Stockton University, where she was a professor of history, but had also spent 7 years as administrator in the provost office. She has a PhD from the University of Michigan. She has 2 MAs, one in liberal studies and another one in museum studies, and a BA from UCLA. Before she joined the faculty at Stockton University, she was a fellow at the Harvard Business School, and that's because her research is really focused on economic history, and that's her book is a study of coffee as a commodity. Now, she's published a number of different articles and essays. She's the co-author of a book on public drinking in early modern world. She's published in the William & Mary Quarterly, several anthologies, the Journal of the Early Republic, Commonplace. I could go on and on. Her scholarship has been supported by some of the most distinguished institutions in the United States, such as the Fulbright Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the McNeil Center for Early American Studies, the Library Company of Philadelphia itself, and a host of other ones. And all that support and all that experience is incredible, but we're not here because of all that Michelle has done. We're here tonight to celebrate her new book, her new work of scholarship, Coffee Nation, How One Commodity Transformed the Early United States. Now, I have to admit, you're probably thinking I'm biased. It's probably in my job description to tout how great this book is, so don't take my word for it. The first reviews are out. This is the first review, 6 pages, single-spaced, and here are some of the things that other scholars are saying about the book. It is a major contribution to the history of commodities and to the economic history of the United States. It is written in accessible and often witty prose. It is an example of cultural history at its very best. And Michelle is going to come up on stage and give us a little taste of this work, but I hope you all will drink it in, I just thought of that pun, by buying that book afterwards. And Michelle will be here to sign it as well. Michelle?
I'm going to move out of my way. Good evening. First of all, thank you so much for coming out tonight. It is a beautiful evening after a fairly warm day, and it's very nice to see so many friendly faces and some new faces in the audience and to be able to share this work with you. And my thanks also to the APS for organizing tonight's event. I realize many people participated in creating this opportunity for me, and I appreciate their doing so. So let's get started. Women began gathering in front of a warehouse in Boston early in the morning of July 24th, 1777. It was about a year after North America's 13 colonies had declared their independence. At first, there were only a few. By mid-morning, there were dozens. And by the time the building's owner, a local merchant named Thomas Boylston, arrived, more than 100 women were waiting for him. For years, the city's residents had complained about the cost of their groceries, and for very good reasons. Since Boston had passed a non-importation agreement in 1768 to protest parliamentary taxes, the price of almost everything had skyrocketed. The situation only got worse after the outbreak of war. Here we go. Abigail Adams was in Boston at this time, while her husband was here in Philadelphia. And she frequently wrote to him about the trials and tribulations of living in a city at siege, as well as Bostonians' growing irritation with merchants and with shopkeepers. There is a general cry against the merchants, she'd written to him earlier that year, who 'tis said have created a partial scarcity of every article, not only of luxury, but even the necessaries of life. The women who confronted Boylston in the summer of 1777 came with one very specific necessary of life in mind: coffee. Today, coffee is traded and consumed worldwide. It is so common that its popularity is often taken for granted. But even everyday habits have a history. When and why coffee became part of North America's daily life is at the center of Coffee Nation, How One Commodity transformed the early United States. Now, I'm often asked why I chose to write a book about coffee, and the answer, honestly, is by accident. My first semester in graduate school, I took a course in early British history, and I became interested in the idea of what I was calling public literacy, how people who can't read or write get their news. Taverns, inns, and coffee houses were some of the places that I explored. Places where current events were read aloud, where ideas were argued and debated. The following semester, I took a course in Atlantic history, which explored how Europe and Africa and the Americas became interwoven from the 15th century on. Now, since I'd already been reading about coffee houses, and so many scholars have already studied the early history of sugar, I thought I would look at coffee cultivation. And what I found was this. While consumer historians had studied how and where coffee became popular in different parts of the world, most of their work was written as if the coffee was just there, ready for drinking. By the same token, books about coffee planting, most of which focus on Central and South America, went into great detail about how coffee was grown, how it was harvested, how it was packaged, how it was prepared for shipping, but usually ended at the docks, with ships ready to take the produce abroad. Rarely did these authors speak to each other. And that's how the idea for this book came to be. A broad history that follows coffee from its first domestication in Ethiopia through early Middle Eastern trade routes and farming experiments in the East Indies, and then across the Atlantic into the Caribbean, and ultimately into the stores and the dining rooms and the export warehouses of North America, which became, within 50 years of American independence, one of the largest suppliers of coffee to the world. Now, this was not an easy project. Although in all fairness, I don't know many historians who say, that was a piece of cake. And if I did, candidly, I would not want to sit next to them at a dinner party, because really, who needs that? There were no big coffee merchants in the way that there were for sugar or for wine or for linen until the 19th century. So instead, I wove the history of coffee together from brief notices that some number of bags or barrels had arrived in port, or that friends had met in each other's homes, or went to the coffee house for the latest political news, through glimpses in account books, letters and diaries, newspaper advertisements, and, in the case of smuggling, court records. But the sheer volume of these references demonstrates coffee's omnipresence in colonial America and the early United States. It quickly became apparent that the drink is everywhere when you start to look. So this evening, I've chosen 6 people to help me tell this story. Each one represents a different aspect of coffee's history: cultivation, trade, consumption, politics, smuggling, and advertising. We start with Sir Nicholas Laws. Now, Sir Nicholas Laws, who served as Jamaica's colonial governor from 1718 to 1722, seems a bit far afield from the early United States, but bear with me. He had grown up on a sugar plantation, but his family's success meant that, like many wealthy planters, he'd spent most of his adult life in England. He only returned to Jamaica when it was in trouble. Years of administrative mismanagement have resulted in a government of corruption and a colony in debt. Now, during his first 2 years in office, Laws wrote more than 40 letters, shipping reports, and depositions to Parliament documenting Spanish Cuba's attack on British ships and efforts to track down and re-enslave people who had escaped into Jamaica's mountainous interior. In his last 2 years as governor of Jamaica, he helped the island weather a devastating hurricane and presided over the trials of Captain Jack Rackham, otherwise known as Calico Jack, and 10 others accused of piracy. Is it little wonder then, in 1722, that at the age of nearly 70, all Laws wanted to do was to return to his plantation and resume his botanical experiments. He died less than a decade after he left office. But in his final years, he left Jamaica a legacy that proved more enduring than his efforts to staunch smuggling, provide hurricane relief, or prosecute pirates. And that is because in 1728, Laws planted Jamaica's first coffee trees, forever changing the island's economy, its community, its landscape, as well as the lives of thousands of enslaved Africans and Afro-Jamaicans coerced into this new commodity system. Now, though Laws only lived to see the first few harvests, the crop was promising enough that more than 20 of his fellow planters petitioned Parliament for support. Whitehall responded in 1732 with an act for encouraging the growth of coffee in His Majesty's plantations in America, the first of several laws that paved the way for cultivation to thrive in the British West Indies. And the results are readily apparent in the shift of coffee production from the east to the west as the 18th century progressed. And here you can see earlier on in the first two columns, right, in the beginning of the 18th century through 1724, there's no production that's coming out of the Caribbean. But by 1749, you begin to have a significant jump, and by 1772, Caribbean coffee now dominates the British market. A generation later, the results of Britain's decision to invest in Caribbean coffee were easy to see. And this brings me to the second of tonight's characters, William West, Jr., a merchant who in April of 1765 was waiting in Philadelphia's harbor for the arrival of the ship Polly. And just in case he's listening virtually, my dissertation advisor at the University of Michigan, a man named David Hancock, told me once, because I rewrote this particular chapter about coffee coming into Philadelphia so many times, if the good ship Polly sails one more time, Michelle, one more time. David, this is for you if you're listening. The Polly had left Kingston, Jamaica, carrying casks of coffee and sugar, bags of limes, and barrels of rum. And there was nothing really remarkable about this voyage. The goods were common island exports, popular with North American buyers, and the route the ship traveled was one sailed by hundreds of vessels in and out of Philadelphia that year. The West family had come from Ireland in 1750, and West Jr. would ultimately serve as a captain in the 3rd Pennsylvania Regiment. But this morning, thoughts of war were far from his mind. Instead, he was waiting for his share of the Polly's coffee, which he would then send to Charleston, South Carolina. Other casks on that ship belonged to William Redmond, who would send them as far north as Newport, Rhode Island. But the majority of the coffee that arrived that morning had been bought by a local firm named Craig, Fuller, and Ash, and would be sold within Philadelphia and nearby towns in Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey. Now, Philadelphia was not the only British North American city to import coffee, of course, but it did bring in the most. The principal port of Pennsylvania had entered the West Indies trade after Boston and after New York, both of which had developed very solid foundations in the sugar and rum industries. So rather than compete, Philadelphia traders began testing interest in several goods that collectively became known as the secondary commodities. And by the 1760s, when William West was standing on those docks, Philadelphia led American importation of ginger, of pepper, and of coffee, accounting for a third and sometimes up to half of what came into the mainland in any given year. To see who bought it, I looked at tax lists, at city directories, and especially at newspaper advertisements. This last source was really fascinating. The number of vendors selling coffee almost doubled between 1765 and 1775. Now, that the number of advertisers should grow is an interesting conclusion, but what these notices tell us about where in the city coffee was being sold, and by extension to whom, is just as important. About a third of these sellers were based in High Street, Chestnut, and Walnut Ward. These are the districts that are closest to the city's ports and its largest public markets, so perhaps to be expected. Another third of these sellers had businesses in North, Middle, and South Ward, which housed the principal business districts and some of the city's wealthiest neighborhoods. So again, not terribly surprising. But coffee was also sold in the Upper and Lower Delaware wards, which were working class neighborhoods, and even in Mulberry and Dock wards, home to marginal communities, single and widowed women, as well as most of Philadelphia's free black community. In other words, anyone who lived in any ward in Philadelphia and who wanted to buy coffee could find it within easy walking distance. All of these drinkers benefited from the commercial networks created by William West and his fellow merchants, and helped to create the market of North America's coffee, which tied it to the plantations of the West Indies. This habit also tied colonies to Europe, however, which produced most of the ceramics and the metalwares used to brew and serve coffee, as well as the advice literature and the cookbooks, which taught them the best ways to do so. And social custom is precisely what concerned Jane Shippen, the third person I'm introducing this evening. When she wrote to her husband in 1772 about her trip to visit relatives in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The Shippens were part of a powerful and influential family of doctors, of lawyers, of merchants, of landowners who held offices in Pennsylvania's colonial government. Joseph's father had been elected mayor of Philadelphia in 1744 and later to be the judge of the Court of Common Pleas. Now, overall, Jane thought her visit was going well. The home was lovely, the company was delightful, if a little provincial, but she took pains to alert her husband to what she considered a serious social gaffe. Her hosts, it seems, would routinely put out fewer coffee cups than there were guests, and remedied the situation by substituting teacups. And this reminded Jane that half of her own coffee set was cracked or chipped, and she implored Joseph to order replacements so that she would never face this same dilemma. And what her letter illustrates is that not only was coffee drinking common, but also that rules of etiquette and other distinctions were coming into play. Some families could afford complete coffee sets, while others were apparently less picky, and so mixed and matched crockery to just make do. In other words, not every coffee drinker drank coffee the same way. There were options. At the top of the market was sterling silver. This set was fashioned by Joseph Richardson Jr., part of a noted family of Philadelphia silversmiths, and incidentally is currently on view in the APS exhibition Philadelphia, the Revolutionary City, which if you haven't visited yet, you really should. The museum is open Thursdays through Sundays. It is free to the public, and the display will be up until December 28th. Thus ends the public announcement portion of my presentation. For those who wanted the look but couldn't afford the luxury of sterling silver, you could try silver plate. In fact, with the advent of what became known as Sheffield plating, which bonded silver to copper with a little bit of zinc and lead mixed in, coffee pots could be plated on the inside as well as the outside, and it became nearly impossible for the casual observer to tell the difference. Coffee pots could also be fashioned in Chinese export porcelain, in stoneware, in creamware, which was not just cream, by the way. Think of tortoiseshell ware, or what we have here, cauliflower ware, and agate ware. I know, they did all kinds of crazy things to coffee pots, I don't understand. And painted tin. All of these could be richly decorated, ensuring that options for displaying personal taste and a sense of style were available no matter where you fell on the socioeconomic ladder. Shipment from family and friends could also fill the gaps in family cupboards. Writing from London in 1758, the year he first published The Way to Wealth, Benjamin Franklin, and as an employee of the American Philosophical Society, which was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743, I'm obligated to mention his name in every public presentation at least once. So Benjamin Franklin described the gifts he had sent to his wife, Deborah, including a beer jug, which he thought looked like a fat lady dame, clean and tidy, with a neat blue and white calico gown on, good-natured and lovely, which put him in mind of somebody. I sincerely hope that was Deborah in this letter. But packed within that jar, nestled in the best crystal salt for added protection, were coffee cups, decorated with figures that Franklin urged Deborah to study closely with your spectacles on as they bear examining. Underlying this growing interest in coffee, however, was a persistent reliance on the imperial marketplace. Just as North American colonists imported their beans, they also imported most of their coffee pots, their sugar bowls, their cream pitchers, their spoons, whether fashioned of silver, porcelain, or ceramic. British North America, in other words, depended on others to grow, process, and ship their coffee, as well as produce almost everything else needed to prepare and to serve it. It was an extensive, and it could be, an expensive habit. It was also increasingly a political decision. There is a common misunderstanding that America's interest with coffee rose as that of tea fell. And for a few short months, in 1773 and early 1774, this might have been the case. One English visitor to Alexandria, Virginia, in July of 1774, for example, witnessed the election of town burgesses and later recorded in his diary, "In the evening, George Washington gave a ball to the freeholders and gentlemen of the town. This was conducted with great harmony. Coffee and chocolate, but no tea, which is in disgrace amongst them at present." Even the Boston Tea Party had its coffee moment, when William Russell, a school teacher who participated in the uprising, reputedly emptied his family's tea canister into the fire and wrote "coffee" on one side and "no tea" on the other. But then in 1774, North America expanded its embargo of British goods to include the Caribbean, and that ended coffee's potential as a patriotic proxy. Now, this doesn't mean, however, that people stopped drinking coffee, which is what led to the standoff between Thomas Boylston and those women in Boston that began this presentation. What it demonstrates is differences of opinion, in this case represented by Abigail and John Adams, who are the fourth actors in today's story. Perhaps these actions weighed heavily on Abigail, because Boylston was her husband's cousin, and the man after whom she had named her third child. His hoarding was, she complained, the actions of an eminent, wealthy, and stingy merchant. And clearly, her neighbors agreed. The women that Boston morning demanded his keys, and when he complied, entered the property, this is her writing to John, entered the property and hoisted out the coffee themselves, put it on a truck, and drove off. And Abigail concluded her remarkable account by describing how a large concourse of men stood amazed, having remained silent spectators of the whole transaction. There is a moral to this story. Do not stand between a woman and a cup of coffee when she needs it. But John saw things a little differently. Writing back to his wife, he stressed his hope that females will leave off their attachment for coffee, as it created, he argued, an untenable dependence on foreign trade. "I assure you," he concluded, "that the best families in this place have left off in great measure the use of West India goods. We must bring ourselves to live upon the produce of our own country." At first glance, This event sounds a little like the far better-known Boston Tea Party, which took place only a few years earlier and pitched the effort of a handful of patriots in their quest for extermination against the vast machinery of empire. Now, this familiar tale, one of the best loved of the entire American Revolution, had all of the necessary ingredients for a good intrigue: disguises, bravery, dark of night, and a clearly identified enemy, East Indian tea, as well as a pithy rallying cry: no taxation without representation, which was actually uttered by James Otis or Patrick Henry almost a decade earlier in reaction to the British Stamp Act, but hey, why let the details get in the way of a good story? Like most slogans, this one reduces complicated historical events into an easily digestible soundbite, when the reality was actually much messier. For as the showdown between Boylston and the women confronting him demonstrate, this time in the light of day and face to face, more than one commodity was causing problems. Moreover, while the Boston Tea Party was about Emmett's efforts to limit consumption, Boston's coffee rioters sought the opposite: access to more. Colonial legislators sided with Abigail. Recognizing that colonists were unlikely to give up their coffee, they instead tried to fix the price to avoid precisely the kind of gouging the women accused Boylston of practicing. Delegates from Massachusetts met first with their counterparts in New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, but their actions were soon copied by New York and Pennsylvania. The result was an act to prevent monopolies and oppression by excessive and unreasonable prices. Very catchy. 20 goods were singled out as essential for the public welfare, and coffee was one of them. Taken together, this kind of legislation and public protest reveal how popular coffee had become by the 1770s. Coffee drinking was not the habit of a privileged few, it was the daily and demanded habit of the many, considered as important to protect as wheat, as pork, as butter, as potatoes. Indeed, North Americans drank so much coffee by the end of the Revolutionary era that when US politicians sought to identify what goods to tax themselves in aid of public revenue, coffee topped the list. South Carolina began taxing coffee in 1783, and Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania all proposed similar laws between 1785 and 1789. And while this may seem ironic, given the role that taxation played in creating the conflict that resulted in the new nation's political independence, state governments needed to balance their budgets and continued to rely on coffee's widespread popularity to generate that income. But where the coffee came from, that coffee that was being taxed, looked very different than it did in 1776. Rather than Jamaica, the coffee most Americans drank after 1783 came from Spanish, Dutch, and especially French colonies, sometimes legally, sometimes less so. And this brings us to the fifth person in tonight's presentation, Pierre Rondon, a free black overseer who in 1792 piloted 2 canoes filled with 16 bags of coffee from Roseau, Dominica's capital city, Dominica, a very small island in the Eastern Antilles. Soon after he set sail, he was hailed by another vessel. Although Rondon initially ignored this, he testified later that, quote, a musket or some kind of gun was fired twice, and so he stopped for fear that either he or the enslaved workers with whom he was traveling might be killed or injured. The ship that was signaling to him was a British frigate, captained by a man named James Alms. Through a translator, because like many in Dominica, Rondon spoke French rather than English, he told him he was ferrying coffee from the British island to resell in Basseterre, which was the capital of neighboring French Guadeloupe. When pressed for more information about where this cargo might ultimately go, Rondon speculated that it was probably destined for North America, as he said many U.S. ships came to the French colony. Now, selling coffee outside the British Empire without paying foreign duties was illegal, and Alms asked to see the cargo's customs papers. Rondon responded in disbelief that he didn't have any, and moreover that he had been long accustomed to carrying coffee in like manner and had never heard of such a thing as a permit being required. Rosso merchants quickly tamped down the situation, persuading the courts that the overseer had misunderstood his instructions, and the coffee was released into their custody with a strong admonition to get the appropriate paperwork next time. But given the length of time that Rondon had been working as an overseer, these claims of confusion seem suspect. Instead, what I think happened is that 2 canoes out of an untold number of vessels and cargoes that Rondon and others had successfully taken beyond British borders to supply the coffee needs of North America had been caught. Now, smuggling was one way to move coffee around the region, but there were others. Some colonial governors turned a blind eye, more interested in the goods they got in return than enforcing imperial law. Some custom officials even collaborated, doctoring papers to transform U.S. vessels into a British ship, a French ship, even a Spanish ship. And some empires experimented with free ports, which are, as the name implies, the 18th century equivalent of duty-free. Each brought some coffee into the United States, but not nearly enough to satisfy a growing demand. To do so, merchants turned to the French West Indies, which accounted for more than 60% of all coffee sold to North America by 1789, a share that rose to 77% just 2 years later. The leading partner in this pattern was Saint-Domingue, now known as Haiti, which sent less than 4 million pounds of coffee to the United States in 1789, but almost 54 million pounds of coffee 5 years later. It was a spectacularly profitable business until the Haitian Revolution ended slavery in Saint-Domingue, and the American government embargoed all trade with the newly independent Free Black Nation in 1806. U.S. merchants once again searched for a regular coffee supplier, and this time, the answer would be Brazil. Coffee had been a minor industry in the Portuguese colony through the 1810s, overshadowed by both sugar and cotton, but the gap created in the coffee market after Haiti's revolution resulted in patterns both there and in the United States that would become amazingly profitable and a global industry for both nations. For Brazil, this was its independence from the Empire of Portugal in 1822. For the United States, this was a strange combination of taxes and temperance. Think back to what I told you about states deciding to tax coffee after the American Revolution to raise state revenue. Their success caught the eye of many federal figures, including Alexander Hamilton, when he was arguing for federal tariffs on foreign goods, especially coffee, sugar, tobacco, and tea. Now, 2 of these, sugar and tobacco, also grew in the United States, and so taxing what came in from abroad helped bolster domestic production. But despite these best efforts of botanists and of entrepreneurs, there was no domestic option for either coffee or for tea. This is a hint. Somebody asked me a question about whether we ever tried to grow coffee in North America in the Q&A. Just dropping that pin. It'll come to you. In 1828, no less than Andrew Jackson entered the fray, arguing that the duties of those articles of importation which cannot come in competition with our own productions are the first that should engage the attention of Congress in the modification of the tariff. Of these, tea and coffee are the most important. They enter largely into the consumption of the country and have become articles of necessity to all classes. He was persuasive, and in 1832, exactly 1 century after Britain first repealed taxes to encourage coffee planting in the Caribbean, the United States became the only nation in the world not to tax foreign coffee. The following year, imports leapt to 100 million pounds. 20 years later, it was double that. But if U.S. importers recognized their increasing dependence on one supplier, most coffee drinkers did not. Instead, coffee's marketers and sellers very consciously aligned themselves with U.S. interests and images, as well as the nation's expansionist dreams. Take, for example, this advertisement from Old Dominion, touting its coffee and its coffee pot as part of the rich historical legacy of Virginia. There is a state well known to fame that every man admires, the noblest of the old 13, the state that never tires, the mother she of presidents, and it is our intention to show that she has given birth through genius and invention to something more than one who rules the people of a nation that is the boon to bless mankind throughout the vast creation. Buyers, in other words, were encouraged to see their purchases from the Old Dominion as much more than a way to brew coffee. It was choosing to support a US-based industry, a business with global aspirations. John Arbuckles, who founded the Pittsburgh-based coffee company of Arbuckles and Company, is the sixth and final chapter of tonight's presentation, and he was a master at rebranding. He'd worked in grocery retail for almost 2 decades when he perfected and patented a glaze of egg white and confectioner's sugar to coat coffee beans while they were roasting, and he never looked back. At a time when most vendors were still selling their beans green in paper bags, Arbuckles and Company sold its product roasted, ground, and packaged in distinctive reusable tins. Its success was based on more than a consistent product and packaging, though. Arbuckles sent agents to São Paulo to cultivate relationships with coffee exporters. He invested in Brazilian railroads to ease transportation from mountainous plantations to the coast. He bought a shipping fleet to bring beans directly from Brazilian suppliers to his factories. And his innovative packaging meant that he had a strong hold on consistency, regardless of where he sent the finished product. His flagship brand, Ariosa, became known from coast to coast, its reputation growing as the nation did too. And it was precisely this moment of national expansion and flourishing patriotism that Arbuckles highlighted in his marketing. He developed a series of trade cards, a common sales gimmick by the mid-19th century, to link his still foreign-grown coffee to key ideas and places in the United States. The most popular became a set known as the MAP series, one card for each state. Tobacco for Virginia, grapes for California, silver mining for Colorado, and pottery for New Jersey. Helpful, I thought of blueberries, but helpful hints for brewing the beverage appeared on the back of every card, and in this sense, Arbuckles was shaping his consumers' understanding of the nation, allowing drinkers to celebrate the seeming unstoppable triumph of economic expansion, all while sipping what they now regarded as the nation's brew. It was masterful, it was profitable, and it is, I would argue, coffee became Americanized. Now, depending on the time and place, coffee has been characterized as exotic, as common, as foreign, as patriotic. This industry is bound up with the history of colonialism, with enslavement, with revolution, and with nationalism. The United States remains the largest buyer of coffee in the world, and Brazil remains one of its leading suppliers. This web of interdependence is now 2 centuries old and generated $8.2 billion for the United States last year. This is the story of Coffee Nation, an Ethiopian plant transplanted first to the East Indies before being brought across the Atlantic to become a Caribbean staple. The same beverage, growing to become a leading import in Philadelphia, redistributed beyond the city into other colonies in the backcountry. It is the story of how coffee and coffee houses became embroiled in revolutionary activity, turning what had been sites of business into platforms for protest, and ultimately, how the United States invested heavily in the products of other nations, first in the West Indies and then in Brazil, to create a global coffee network on which it depends and which persists to this day. Thank you. And now I think we have some time for some questions. And we have some microphones which are coming around so that people can hear you both in the room and on Zoom. Oh, I forgot to say, welcome to those of you who are on Zoom. We're glad you're here. Ish.
Thank you, Michelle, for a great talk. You mentioned that during the colonial period, coffee did not really replace tea. But today, Americans, at least my impression, drink much more coffee than tea. So do we have Arbuckle to thank for that? Or how did that sort of thing come about?
That's a great question. If I had a slide in, I recognize, again, as someone who's a business historian, I am fascinated by numbers. But some reason, not everyone is. I don't know why. I have another table in the book that charts the growth of coffee relative to tea. So in that conversation in 1832 that I had mentioned with Andrew Jackson, both commodities actually had first a reduction and then an abolition of tariffs. And you can chart from 1832 for the next 25 or so years how much tea and coffee came in and how much revenue, and what that was valued at in terms of US dollars. And you see a massive tipping point from coffee to tea. So really between 1830, as early as 1850, we had become a coffee drinking nation.
Hi. Hi. I'm very interested more of learning about how Brazil filled that gap, especially with the embargo. And then you later talked about how Arbuckle invested a lot in Brazil to help his business. But before Arbuckle, did you see any more investments, be it individuals or the government, to kind of fill that huge gap through Brazil, through any kind of funds or initiatives or diplomacy?
Really great questions. Not significantly before the 1820s. The first recorded shipment of Brazilian coffee that I could find for the United States wasn't until 1810. Before then, really, the West Indies were the dominant suppliers. What happened after the Haitian Revolution was the Saint-Domingue, as the French Caribbean colony, was the jewel of the French Empire, and it produced more than half the world's sugar and more than 60% of the world's coffee. After the Haitian Revolution, there was a significant global gap in both of these commodities. There had been earlier experiments in Brazil and in other parts of Latin America in coffee, but it wasn't until after 1822 that this became both an industry that Brazil invested in and that the United States invested in. Arbuckles is one example. All of the major coffee importers were beginning to send agents, were beginning to buy shipping fleets, were investing in Brazilian railroads, and I should also say, facilitating the ongoing importation of enslaved people in Brazil. It is not an understatement to say that US investment in Brazilian coffee and its spectacular rise through the 19th century is one of the reasons why Brazil was the last place in the Americas to abolish slavery, not until 1898.
Hello.
Yes.
Thanks for your talk. I'm curious about your research for like the early importation of coffee, and was it more fruitful to look at like the imperial, like the sources of the imperialism, or was it fruitful to look at like the colonies themselves in the West Indies, or where was your research?
Both. I spent a lot of time with British Naval Office shipping lists, which were required out of the colonies on a regular basis to be sent back to London to document both production levels and sale levels. And they are, now this project took a while. I'm going to tell you this project took a while. In fact, I will go ahead and say that if this book were a child, it would now be of legal drinking age. Ironic for a coffee book, right? And the reason why I'm telling you this is it was after I had done my research on the Naval Office shipping list through a fantastic fellowship which allowed me to go to London and stay for some period of time that the Naval Office shipping lists were digitized. Yay! It's good for fact-checking, though. But I also looked at colonial registers because the Naval Office shipping list would tell me how much coffee had been produced and where it had gone. But much coffee, as I just mentioned with that example for William West, was reshipped, was transshipped to different places. So that's only going to get you the first port of embarkation. I spent a good deal of time, and that's where places like the McNeil Center for Early American Studies and the Library Company of Philadelphia were such beneficial supporters of this work. I spent a lot of time looking at merchant records in Philadelphia. So it was both sides of the equation.
Hello, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. Did we ever try to grow coffee in North America?
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. The answer is yes. We tried several times. My favorite example is from 1821, and it was undertaken by a man named Pierre Rondon, who came to the North America from Saint-Domingue during the Haitian Revolution. He later anglicized his name to Peter Stephen Chazot. But he writes this petition, first in 1819, to the U.S. Congress, which this is after the United States had acquired Florida. He writes this petition to Congress with the backing of several other, what he calls true national patriots, although a number of them have French surnames, for the East Florida Coffee Land Association. And he wants 50,000 acres of land near Key Largo to try experimenting with a variety of tropical crops, including, as their name would indicate, the East Florida Coffee Land Association coffee, right? Their petition is fantastic, and it includes a huge amount of data about how much coffee was coming into North America, about what the growing conditions were in terms of longitude and latitude. It really couches itself in this patriotic language, right? This would be doing a national benefit for the national good by reducing our foreign dependency. There's even an expedition that leaves from Philadelphia and goes down to Key Largo, and there's records in newspapers of where they arrive and how people respond. They change their name to the United States Coffee Association, becoming even more patriotic. In all of this material, it astounds me that while they're looking this way, and they're looking this way, they're not looking this way, right? Coffee grows best at 2,000 feet above sea level. It grows even better at 4,000 feet above sea level. Would anyone like to guess what the average above sea level is in Key Largo? Not good. It's not good. Coffee would never have succeeded there. There were several other experimenters who tried planting coffee trees, but we just don't have the right climate for growing it, certainly not on a large commercial level. And there were efforts to try to find coffee substitutes. There were state and federal botanical competitions. They would look at things like toasted rye, chicory, that one stuck around for some time, or roasted potatoes. None of these worked. They're very bad, very bad. But there were some real interest. Even George Washington becomes interested, and Thomas Jefferson becomes interested in something they call Kentucky coffee for a while, these huge nuts that grow on a tree, and they think maybe if they grind these, they can get something. No, they really can't. Okay. Coffee was here to stay, and importing it was the only way to get it. Thank you for the question.
Hi, great presentation. I bought your book.
Oh, thank you.
And I started reading it. I'm really enjoying it. I got the impression in the first chapter or so that I'm just now in that not only early on was the U.S. kind of an engine for growing demand, but that somehow distribution later globally was something that the U.S. was very good at. Can you talk about that just for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. What you're referring to is the re-export trade. So the United States imported more coffee than any other country by 1850, but it also re-exported coffee around the world. And the ultimate takeaway, at one point, it was coffee, this one commodity, it outstripped sales in sugar, it outstripped sales in wine, it outstripped combined a variety of different commodities. It was the equivalent of 15% of our re-export trade income. This is a huge amount of our trade income for something we can't produce, right? Most of our re-exported goods were very small, minor industries. Most of our shipping abroad was in things we made, things we grew. That coffee became such a prominent re-exported commodity, and still is, by the way, was phenomenal. That's why I had a real argument with my publisher. This is a good title. This is a good title. I'll thank my husband for this title. Where is he? There he is. I'll thank my husband for this title. I wanted to call it Caffeine Dependence, because to me, it's a good one too, right? To me, really, what this book is about is how the United States not just became dependent on coffee as a beverage, but became dependent on coffee as an economy, right? And it still plays a major role in our culture and with our relationships around the world.
Hey, Michelle.
Oh, hey. Oh.
You probably won't be surprised to hear this question from me. What was Arbuckle thinking with the sugar and the egg whites before roasting?
So, no, it was while it was roasting. It created a sheen, and he thought a protective barrier. It's not as crazy as it sounds. If you look at earlier cookbooks from the late 18th and early 19th century, you see a variety of very odd ways to prepare coffee. Butter was one that was used in roasting, had been used in roasting for quite a period of time. His innovation was adding it with confectioner's sugar and creating this glaze, a hard glaze that was on the roasted beans that he thought created a protective barrier. My least favorite, though not uncommon, my least favorite example of a coffee recipe was the addition of isinglass, which is made from the swim bladders of sturgeon. It was like a gelatin, so it created kind of an affixing across the coffee beans, but if it's all the same with you, I think I'll take my coffee without a side of fish.
All right, we have one final question.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I'm curious about Arbuckle. You said that he shipped directly. Was that up the Mississippi and the Ohio? How did he ship?
No, by that time, that's an excellent question. By that time, he had expanded. He had processing plants in a variety of port cities, most notably New York. So he was able to ship directly to the East Coast and then redistribute to processing places in other cities in North America. But thank you for the question. Thank you all so much for joining me this evening. I hope you enjoyed it and have a great night.